A pilot cruises 13 miles above the Earth, alone in a cockpit designed for one, breathing recycled oxygen through a pressure suit that transforms him into something between astronaut and ghost. Below, the Ural Mountains stretch toward horizons he can see curving at this altitude. Above, the sky darkens toward the blackness of space. At 70,500 feet, the air is too thin to sustain consciousness without mechanical assistance. Commercial aircraft fly at 35,000 feet. Soviet interceptors max out at 60,000. Nothing can reach him here. That's what they told him. That's what he believed. 13 miles below, in a bunker outside Sverdlovsk, radar operators watch a blip crawl across their screens. They've seen these contacts before. For 4 years, aircraft have violated Soviet airspace at altitudes beyond interception, photographing military installations, missile sites, nuclear facilities. Each incursion was tracked, protested through diplomatic channels, and ultimately ignored. The aircraft were untouchable. Until today. Colonel Mikhail Voronov commands a battery of S-75 Dvina missiles. NATO calls them SA-2 guidelines. Their operational ceiling has just been upgraded to 70,000 feet. The Americans don't know this yet. The first salvo launches at 9:52 a.m. Multiple missiles ascending on columns of flame, tracking the slow-moving target that has photographed half of Soviet strategic infrastructure this morning alone. The pilot sees nothing, hears nothing. The cockpit instruments show normal readings. Then the sky behind him turns orange. The missile doesn't strike directly. It detonates close enough. The blast concussion shears off the aircraft's tail assembly, and the fragile airframe designed for altitude rather than durability begins tearing itself apart. The pilot is thrown against his canopy as the cockpit spins. His pressure suit keeps him alive in the thin atmosphere, but the centrifugal force pins him to his seat. Somewhere behind him is a destruct switch designed to eliminate the cameras and film. He has 70 seconds to activate it. He cannot reach it. The aircraft disintegrates around him as he falls. The ejection is violent and uncontrolled. One moment he's trapped in spinning wreckage. The next, he's tumbling through empty sky, his parachute deploying automatically at 15,000 feet. The descent takes 4 minutes. 4 minutes of falling through Soviet airspace, watching the ground rise toward him, knowing that everything he was trained to prevent has just become inevitable. The poison pin sits unused in its silver dollar case. The aircraft that was never supposed to be captured is scattering across collective farms below, and Francis Gary Powers is about to become the most visible spy in American history. Soviet farmers reach him first, then soldiers, then men in civilian clothes who ask questions in careful English and already seem to know the answers. Within hours, KGB teams have secured the wreckage scattered across a 20-mile radius. What they find inside transforms a diplomatic embarrassment into an international catastrophe. The cameras are intact. Hicon Type B units loaded with 70mm film, containing thousands of exposures of Soviet military installations. The maps are marked with flight routes across denied territory. The radio equipment carries frequencies that match known American intelligence channels. And tucked inside a hollowed silver dollar, they find a needle coated with shellfish toxin, a suicide device the pilot chose not to use. The wreckage tells a story that Washington has been denying for 4 years. Not weather research, not atmospheric sampling, not any of the careful lies constructed to explain aircraft that flew too high for questions. The debris spread across those Soviet farms would humiliate a superpower, collapse a summit, and expose the architecture of American espionage that had operated invisibly since 1956. The poison pin lay unused. Francis Gary Powers had chosen to live, and in living, he had become the most dangerous witness in the Cold War. This is the story of how a single missile shattered the most sophisticated lie in American history. How technology designed to be invisible became the most visible evidence of systematic deception. How a pilot's decision to survive transformed a diplomatic embarrassment into a superpower humiliation that derailed peace talks and deepened the Cold War by a decade. It's about the architecture of plausible deniability, the careful construction of cover stories, false identities, and official explanations designed to make espionage look like meteorology. And it reveals something uncomfortable that governments still struggle to acknowledge. Sovereignty means nothing when nations possess the technology and will to violate it. Borders exist on maps, not in the stratosphere where aircraft fly beyond the reach of consent. The wreckage scattered across those Soviet farms exposed more than cameras and film. It exposed a world where superpowers operated by different rules than they publicly proclaimed, where lies were policy and truth was whatever remained after evidence vanished. Understanding how Powers ended up alone at 70,000 feet requires understanding who he was and the secret program that transformed ordinary pilots into instruments of invisible warfare. Born in 1929 in Burdine, Kentucky, Francis Gary Powers grew up in coal country, where the mountains swallowed light and men descended into darkness to extract the fuel that powered American industry. His father worked the mines before becoming a shoe cobbler. His mother stretched paychecks across weeks that never seemed to end. From childhood, he watched men emerge from tunnels covered in black dust, their lungs already filling with the particles that would eventually kill them. Every sunrise illuminated the same future. You went into the mines. You came out coughing. You did it again until you couldn't. Powers decided early that his escape would be upward. Appalachia in the 1930s and 40s offered few alternatives to the coal economy. The Depression had hollowed out communities that were already marginal. Schools taught basic literacy and the expectation that sons would follow fathers underground. But Powers possessed something that set him apart from his classmates: an obsessive fascination with aircraft. He built model planes from scraps, memorized specifications from magazines he couldn't afford to buy, and watched the occasional aircraft cross the sky above Jenkins with a focus that bordered on religious. School records describe him as quiet but focused, more interested in mathematics and mechanics than literature or history. He wasn't rebellious. He followed rules, completed assignments, avoided the kind of attention that made teachers remember names. His discipline bordered on invisibility, a quality that would later define his value to organizations that required men capable of disappearing into routine. The military offered the path he needed. In 1950, Powers enlisted in the Air Force, seeking flight training that civilian life couldn't provide. He earned his commission in 1952, qualifying as a fighter pilot with marks that impressed instructors less for brilliance than for consistency. He flew F-84 Thunderjets in Georgia, mastering the technical requirements without demonstrating the aggressive instincts that marked natural combat pilots. Officers noted his temperament in evaluations: reliable, methodical, follows procedures precisely, lacks initiative but compensates with discipline. These qualities made him invisible to promotion boards. They made him invaluable to recruiters from an agency that officially didn't exist. In 1956, a man in civilian clothes approached Powers at Turner Air Force Base with an offer that seemed too unusual to be legitimate: higher altitude work, substantially higher pay. The nature of the missions would remain classified. Powers asked few questions. The ones he did ask received answers that explained nothing while promising everything. His salary would jump from $8,400 per year to $30,000. His Air Force commission would be quietly suspended. His employer would be listed as Lockheed Aircraft Corporation, though Lockheed would have no record of his existence. What distinguished Powers from other pilots wasn't exceptional skill, but exceptional suitability. He wasn't driven by adventure, but by pragmatism. He viewed flying as engineering rather than art, a science of instruments and procedures rather than instinct. Recruiters described him as ideal material, calm under pressure, incurious about matters beyond his mission parameters, and possessing the psychological capacity to operate alone at altitudes where human presence seemed almost philosophical. Training took place at a facility in Nevada that appeared on no maps and carried designations that changed regularly: Watertown Strip, Paradise Ranch. The pilots who gathered there learned to fly an aircraft unlike anything in military service. The U-2 was essentially a powered glider with a wingspan of 80 feet and a cruising altitude that exceeded 70,000 feet. Its cockpit was cramped. Its controls were sensitive. Its margin for error at operational altitude was measured in seconds. A stall meant death. An oxygen failure meant death. The aircraft demanded constant attention and rewarded it with access to airspace that no other nation could reach. Powers adapted to the U-2's demands with the same methodical consistency that had characterized his entire career. He memorized procedures. He practiced emergency protocols. He learned to exist in a pressure suit for 9 hours at a stretch, breathing recycled oxygen, monitoring instruments that measured his survival in percentages. A colleague later recalled his approach to the work. Frank didn't love flying. He respected it. He understood that the aircraft was trying to kill him every second, and he just kept not letting it. By 1960, Powers had flown 27 operational missions over denied territory. Each flight had penetrated Soviet airspace without interception. Each return had delivered thousands of photographs to analysts who never knew his name. He had become what the program required: invisible, reliable, replaceable. What he didn't know was that Soviet radar had been tracking U-2s for years, that engineers in classified facilities had been working to extend missile range beyond what American intelligence believed possible, and that the altitude he trusted to protect him had become a mathematical problem with a solution that was nearly complete. Powers believed he flew beyond the reach of consequences. That belief was about to be tested at 70,500 feet above Sverdlovsk. The U-2 program was born from fear. In 1954, American intelligence faced a terrifying vacuum. They had almost no reliable information about Soviet military capabilities. Satellite technology didn't exist. Human agents inside the USSR were being systematically identified and eliminated. And the questions that kept defense planners awake at night remained unanswerable. How many bombers did the Soviets possess? Where were their missile installations? Were they preparing for a first strike that would arrive without warning? The bomber gap haunted Washington. Intelligence estimates suggested the Soviets might possess hundreds more long-range aircraft than the United States. These estimates were based on assumptions rather than evidence, fear rather than observation. President Eisenhower understood that decisions about nuclear arsenals and military budgets couldn't rely on guesswork. He needed eyes above Soviet territory. He authorized what became known as Project Aquatone, an aircraft that would fly so high that Soviet defenses couldn't reach it, gathering photographs of everything below while remaining invisible to radar, interceptors, and diplomatic consequence. Lockheed's Skunk Works division received the contract. Kelly Johnson, the engineer who had designed the P-38 Lightning in World War II, approached the problem with characteristic directness. The aircraft needed to cruise above 70,000 feet. It needed range exceeding 3,000 miles. And it needed to carry cameras capable of reading newspaper headlines from 13 miles up. Johnson's solution looked less like a fighter than a powered glider. Enormous wings spanning 80 feet, a single engine, a cockpit so cramped that pilots couldn't wear standard flight suits. The design sacrificed everything for altitude: armor, weapons, redundant systems, all eliminated to reduce weight. The result was an aircraft of extraordinary fragility that could reach airspace no other nation had accessed. The first U-2 flew in August 1955. Operational missions began the following July. On Independence Day 1956, a U-2 crossed into Soviet airspace for the first time and photographed military installations around Leningrad and Moscow. The images revealed details that human intelligence had never provided: aircraft on runways, missiles on launch pads, facilities whose existence had only been rumored. Eisenhower reviewed the photographs personally and authorized continued overflights despite the diplomatic risk. To the CIA, the U-2 represented a technological solution to an impossible problem. To the Air Force, it was an intelligence asset beyond anything previously imagined. To Lockheed, it was a classified contract worth millions. And to the Soviets, it was a systematic violation of sovereignty that they could detect but not stop. That inability to respond became the program's central assumption. Soviet radar tracked the overflights from the beginning. Diplomatic protests arrived through official channels after each mission, but protests without consequences were merely words. The aircraft flew too high for interception. MiG fighters couldn't reach them. Surface-to-air missiles fell short. And American officials calculated that even if a U-2 was somehow brought down, the pilot would not survive. The aircraft would disintegrate, and no evidence would remain for Soviet propagandists to exploit. Plausible deniability required only that proof never surface intact. Between 1956 and 1960, U-2 aircraft conducted approximately 24 deep penetration overflights of Soviet territory. Each mission brought back thousands of photographs. Each photograph provided intelligence that shaped American understanding of Soviet capabilities. The bomber gap was revealed as fiction. Soviet strategic forces were substantial, but not overwhelming. Nuclear facilities could be monitored for activity. The invisible aircraft had provided something unprecedented in the history of espionage: comprehensive surveillance of an enemy superpower from beyond the reach of retaliation. This success bred confidence that approached arrogance. CIA Director Allen Dulles assured Eisenhower that the program carried acceptable risk. If anything went wrong, the cover story was already prepared. Weather research, aircraft, NASA atmospheric studies. The pilot would carry documentation supporting the fiction, and if the worst occurred, the worst meant death and disintegration. Nothing that could embarrass a superpower. By April 1960, the window for U-2 operations was closing. A summit conference in Paris approached where Eisenhower would meet Khrushchev for potential détente. Once diplomatic negotiations began, overflights would become politically impossible. Dulles pushed for one final mission: a complete Soviet overflight from Pakistan to Norway, photographing missile sites, bomber bases, and nuclear facilities along a route that crossed the heart of Soviet strategic infrastructure. Eisenhower approved Operation Grand Slam. He did not know it would become the most consequential intelligence failure of the Cold War. The assumptions that had protected the program for 4 years were about to be tested by a missile battery outside Sverdlovsk, and a pilot who would choose survival over silence. Peshawar Air Base sat at the edge of empire. A Pakistani facility hosting American operations that officially didn't exist, positioned where the subcontinent met Central Asia, and covert access to Soviet airspace became geographically possible. On April 28, 1960, Francis Gary Powers entered a secure briefing room where maps covered tables and analysts spoke in the careful language of plausible deniability. The mission they described would become the most ambitious reconnaissance flight ever attempted. Operation Grand Slam called for a complete overflight of the Soviet Union. Powers would launch from Peshawar, cross Afghanistan, enter Soviet territory near the Aral Sea, and traverse 3,800 miles of denied airspace before landing at Bodo Air Base in Norway. 9 hours of flight time, thousands of photographs, a route that crossed the Churitum Missile Test Center, the Plesetsk Cosmodrome, and the industrial complexes around Sverdlovsk. Every major Soviet strategic installation lay along his planned path. The aircraft assigned to the mission was designated Article 360, serial number 566693. Ground crews had spent days preparing its systems. The Hicon Type B camera array was calibrated and loaded with fresh film. The pressurization system was tested repeatedly. Every component received inspection, because at 70,000 feet, minor malfunctions became fatal ones. The aircraft carried no weapons. Its only defenses were altitude and the assumption that altitude was enough. Powers reviewed the equipment he would carry, a standard survival kit containing maps, compass, flashlight, hunting knife, and currency from multiple nations, a .22 caliber pistol with ammunition and a silencer, and 2 items that addressed a contingency the briefers discussed in euphemisms. The first was a destruct switch connected to explosive charges positioned near the camera bay. If capture became imminent, Powers was instructed to activate the mechanism and eject. The charges would detonate after 70 seconds, destroying the cameras and film while theoretically allowing the pilot time to clear the aircraft. The second item was a silver dollar. It looked ordinary, the kind of coin that might sit unremarkably in any traveler's pocket. But this dollar had been hollowed and modified. Inside lay a thin needle coated with saxitoxin, a shellfish derivative that would induce cardiac arrest within seconds of breaking skin. The agency offered it without requirement. Pilots could carry the coin or decline. The choice reflected an uncomfortable truth about the program's contingency planning. If the destruct mechanism failed and ejection succeeded, a pilot might face capture rather than death. The needle provided an alternative to interrogation. Powers accepted the dollar. He declined the L-pill, a potassium cyanide capsule that other pilots had carried on previous missions. His reasoning, when later questioned, revealed his characteristic pragmatism. I didn't think it would come to that. The aircraft was supposed to disintegrate. The altitude was supposed to be unreachable. Capture existed as theoretical possibility, not operational expectation. Weather delayed the mission twice. The original launch date of April 29th passed with cloud cover obscuring target areas. April 30th brought similar conditions. Finally, meteorologists confirmed acceptable visibility for May 1st. The date carried unintended significance. May Day was the Soviet Union's most important holiday. Military parades filled Moscow's streets. Soldiers and officials gathered for celebration rather than vigilance. American planners viewed the timing as advantageous, reduced alertness, distracted air defense networks. The holiday would provide additional cover for an aircraft already flying beyond interception range. At 6:26 a.m. local time on May 1st, 1960, Powers lifted off from Peshawar and banked north toward the Hindu Kush. The mountains passed beneath him as he climbed through 50,000 feet, then 60,000, then into the airspace where contrails couldn't form and human survival required mechanical assistance. He crossed into Afghanistan. Then, 90 minutes after departure, he crossed into Soviet territory. Soviet radar detected him within minutes. Tracking stations logged his position and relayed coordinates to air defense commands across his projected route. Interceptors scrambled from multiple bases. Missile batteries received activation orders. The machinery of response that American planners believed inadequate had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. MiG-19 interceptors reached 55,000 feet and could climb no higher. Their pilots watched the American aircraft cruise above them, untouchable. photographing installations they had sworn to protect. The frustration had accumulated over 4 years of similar impotence. But on May 1st, 1960, interceptors were not the primary response. Near Sverdlovsk, a battery of S-75 Dvina missiles had received upgraded guidance systems and extended range. Their operational ceiling now reached beyond 70,000 feet. The Americans didn't know this. The technology that would bring down Powers had been deployed only months earlier. The first hours of his overflight proceeded according to plan. Powers photographed the Tyureta missile complex, capturing images of launch facilities and support infrastructure. He documented airfields near Chelyabinsk. His cameras recorded the industrial sprawl of the Urals with a resolution that allowed analysts to count individual vehicles. The cockpit remained quiet except for the hum of instruments and the whisper of recycled oxygen through his pressure suit. Altitude provided its promised protection. Then he approached Sverdlovsk. At 9:52 a.m. local time, Colonel Mikhail Voronov authorized missile launch. 3 SA-2 missiles rose from their launchers on columns of white exhaust, tracking the slow-moving target that Soviet radar had followed for hours. The first missile malfunctioned and veered off course. The second climbed toward its maximum altitude. The third followed seconds behind. Powers saw none of them. At 70,500 feet, the horizon stretched 300 miles in every direction, but missiles ascending from below remained invisible against the terrain. The near-miss detonation occurred behind and below the aircraft. The SA-2 didn't strike the U-2 directly. It didn't need to. The warhead exploded close enough for the blast concussion to accomplish what a direct hit would have guaranteed. The U-2's tail assembly, designed for weight reduction rather than structural resilience, sheared away. The aircraft pitched forward violently, beginning a spin that centrifugal force made inescapable. In the chaos, a Soviet MiG pilot pursuing the target was killed by another SA-2 from the same battery. Friendly fire in the confusion of an engagement no one had practiced for. Sergei Safronov became an unintended casualty of the operation that would humiliate American intelligence. His death was classified and remained unacknowledged for decades. Powers fought the spin as the cockpit disintegrated around him. His pressure suit kept him conscious in the thin atmosphere, but the G-forces pinned his arms away from the controls. The destruct switch was located behind him, requiring deliberate movement to activate. He had 70 seconds to reach it before ejection. The centrifugal force made those 70 seconds impossible. His canopy had partially detached. His seat restraints held him trapped in an aircraft that was tearing itself apart. Somewhere below lay 3,800 miles of Soviet territory. Somewhere in his pocket lay a silver dollar containing a needle he had chosen not to use. The ejection was not controlled. Powers later described being thrown from the aircraft rather than ejecting properly. One moment the cockpit was spinning. The next he was tumbling through open sky, the wreckage falling separately around him. His parachute deployed automatically at 15,000 feet. The descent that followed lasted nearly 4 minutes. 4 minutes of hanging beneath silk, watching Soviet farmland rise toward him, knowing that everything the program had promised would never happen was now happening. He landed in a field near the village of Degtyarsk. Collective farm workers reached him first, curious about the stranger who had fallen from the sky in a strange suit. Then soldiers arrived. Then KGB officers who had been alerted to the shoot-down and raced to secure whatever remained. Powers offered no resistance. He surrendered his pistol. He surrendered his survival kit. He did not reach for the silver dollar. The wreckage scattered across a 20-mile radius proved more intact than anyone in Washington had predicted. The cameras survived. The film survived. The maps with their marked routes across Soviet territory survived. and Francis Gary Powers, the pilot who was supposed to die with his aircraft, had instead become the most valuable intelligence asset the Soviet Union had captured since the war. The lie that had protected American reconnaissance for 4 years was about to collapse under the weight of evidence that would not disappear. 2 days after the shootdown, NASA issued a press release announcing that a weather research aircraft had gone missing during a routine flight over Turkey. The pilot, identified as Francis G. Palmer, had reported oxygen difficulties near Lake Van before radio contact was lost. Search operations were underway. The statement was crafted with bureaucratic precision. Every detail plausible. Every fact verifiable except the ones that mattered. The aircraft wasn't studying weather. The pilot wasn't named Palmer, and he wasn't missing. He was sitting in Lubyanka prison, answering questions from KGB interrogators who already possessed the cameras, the film, and the maps that proved everything Washington was denying. The State Department reinforced the fiction. No deliberate overflight had occurred. American aircraft respected Soviet sovereignty. The missing plane had simply drifted off course during legitimate scientific research. Officials delivered these assurances with the confidence of men who believed their lives were protected by wreckage they assumed had scattered beyond recovery. On May 5th, Nikita Khrushchev addressed the Supreme Soviet. He announced that Soviet air defense had shot down an American aircraft, violating their airspace. He provided details about the location and timing. He expressed outrage at American aggression, but he withheld 2 crucial facts. The pilot had survived. The wreckage had been recovered intact. Washington responded by deepening the deception. Additional statements emphasized the weather research cover story. Officials expressed hope that the missing pilot would be found alive. They did not know they were walking into a trap that Khrushchev had designed with theatrical precision. On May 7th, the trap closed. Khrushchev returned to the Supreme Soviet with evidence that dismantled every American claim. He presented Francis Gary Powers, alive and cooperative, delivering a confession that detailed his mission, his training, and his employer. He displayed the cameras recovered from the wreckage, the exposed film showing Soviet military installations, the flight maps with routes marked across denied territory, and he showed the silver dollar with its poison needle, the unused instrument of a suicide that Powers had declined to commit. The humiliation was systematic. Each American denial had been documented. Each lie had been allowed to accumulate before demolition. Khrushchev addressed the contradiction with undisguised satisfaction. The whole world knows that Allen Dulles is no great weatherman. Laughter filled the chamber. The architecture of plausible deniability that had protected American reconnaissance for 4 years collapsed in a single afternoon. Eisenhower faced an impossible choice. He could continue denying what the evidence proved, destroying American credibility entirely. Or he could acknowledge espionage operations that violated international law and the sovereignty of another superpower. He chose acknowledgement. For the first time in history, an American president publicly admitted that his government conducted peacetime espionage against another nation. The admission was unprecedented. Its consequences were immediate. The Paris summit had been scheduled to begin on May 14th. Eisenhower and Khrushchev were supposed to discuss arms reduction, Berlin, and potential détente between the superpowers. Instead, Khrushchev demanded a formal apology and punishment for those responsible. Eisenhower refused. The summit collapsed before substantive discussions began. Years of diplomatic preparation evaporated in the fallout from a single aircraft. Powers stood trial in Moscow that August. The proceedings were televised internationally, transforming espionage prosecution into propaganda spectacle. He was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment plus 7 years hard labor. The sentence was never completed. On February 10, 1962, Two figures approached each other on the Glienicke Bridge connecting West Berlin to Potsdam. Powers walked west. Rudolf Abel, born William Fisher, KGB colonel and the highest-ranking Soviet spy ever captured in America, walked east. Neither spoke. Both understood the transaction. They were currency being exchanged in an economy of shadows, their value measured in secrets and embarrassments rather than guilt or innocence. Powers crossed into American custody 21 months after his capture. He returned to a country uncertain whether to treat him as victim or failure. The pilot who was supposed to die had lived. The aircraft that was supposed to disintegrate had provided evidence. The lie that was supposed to hold had shattered completely. And the spy who became visible would spend the rest of his life answering for decisions made at 70,000 feet above Sverdlovsk. What did Francis Gary Powers' shoot-down reveal about the world we live in? That technology provides temporary advantages until adversaries adapt. That lies work only until evidence surfaces to contradict them. That sovereignty exists as principle rather than protection when superpowers possess the capability and will to violate it. The U-2 incident exposed something that governments still struggle to acknowledge. Nations spy. Nations lie about spying. And occasionally, a missile or a malfunction pulls the invisible into visibility, forcing everyone to confront what they already knew but preferred to deny. The Cold War was fought not primarily through armies or missiles, but through shadows, cover stories, and the systematic violation of every boundary that diplomacy claimed to respect. Powers died in 1977 when his helicopter crashed while filming Los Angeles traffic for a television station. An ordinary end for an extraordinary witness. The man who fell from 70,000 feet and survived Soviet imprisonment was killed at 2,000 feet above a California freeway. The silver dollar with its poison pin sits in a museum now. The needle was never used. Some instruments of invisible warfare are preserved precisely because they reveal what they were designed to conceal. The U-2 still flies. Newer versions patrol contested airspaces 65 years after Powers' capture, still photographing what lies below, still operating in the space between acknowledgement and denial. The technology evolved. Satellites replaced pilots for the most sensitive reconnaissance. But the fundamental architecture remains unchanged. Borders exist on maps. Above them, the invisible war continues. Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this investigation into Cold War espionage made you see superpower relations differently, hit that like button and share this video. Subscribe because we're exposing the operations that governments deny and the machinery of power that operates in perpetual shadow. Hit the notification bell. The next buried operation is already unfolding somewhere, waiting to be revealed.